Hello, everybody. I think we're going to get started now and other people can join us as they arrive. So welcome to the first live event of the Gender and Sexuality Week of the Welcome Season, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. I really enjoyed a lot of the conversations that we started last week in the excellent events organised by Dr. Zion Yao, and we'll be continuing discussing some of these issues. That week was called The Matter of Black Lives. And through the work of Sara Ahmed and Audre Lorde, we will continue to discuss issues around race, gender and sexuality. I'm Natasha Tanner. I'm a Leverhulme Research Fellow in the Department of Spanish, Portuguese and Latin American Studies. I joined UCL in January of this year after 2 years as a lecturer at Christ College, University of Cambridge. And I work mainly on queer and feminist literature in Catalan and Spanish. And I've just started learning Nahuatl as well. We've got a lot of exciting events lined up for this week. Tomorrow we have an exciting discussion on contemporary masculinities with novelist and UCL lecturer Matthew Sperling and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Professor Stella Bruzzi. On Thursday, we have the Audre Lorde film screening, followed by a discussion between Victoria Showonmi, Dr. Victoria Showonmi, who's a lecturer at the Institute of Education, UCL, with a student activist, Noella Kalasa, who set up the UCL Justice Collective, and another UCL student, Deepali Foster, who's working to increase accessibility to the theatre and journalism sectors at UCL. So that'll be a really excellent intergenerational discussion I'm really looking forward to. On Friday, we have a creative workshop focusing on trans and non-binary people's experiences of the world, and also on their creative work. But people of all genders are welcome to all of the sessions. So let's turn to Sara Ahmed's work. I've enjoyed setting up a display of her books behind me. I hope you enjoy looking at the wonderful, colourful covers as we go through. I'm just going to share a PowerPoint. So Sara Ahmed, her work has been really influential on mine. So I feel a real personal connection with her prolific output. You can see some of the texts here. She describes her research as being concerned with how bodies and worlds take shape, how power is secured and challenged in everyday life worlds, as well as institutional cultures. And she really insists in a lot of her work that if we're going to be working in institutions, we must work on institutions. And she's written a lot on the issue of so-called diversity and inclusion in institutional life, with particular attention to universities. One of the lines that I used from the Killjoy Manifesto, Principle 5, I'm not willing to get over histories that are not over. When it's not over, it's not the time to get over it, really exemplifies the way she plays with language to raise vital issues in today's world. She's a feminist writer, activist, and self-proclaimed killjoy who works at the intersection of feminist, queer, and race studies. In her work, as we've seen here, she considers how power functions in everyday life, and she encourages us to pay close attention to the structures in which we live and which shape us, and to think about how we might shape them. And indeed, as students at this institution, you do have a very powerful voice in shaping the institution. And I hope that the Killjoy Manifesto will inspire you to do just that. So Ahmed has published widely on the cultures of institutions, and she was Professor of Race and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London, until the end of 2016. She's now an independent scholar, having resigned from Goldsmith, and she alludes to this resignation in the manifesto. And she's very aware of the privilege that she had in being able to walk away. And that actually ties in with something we discussed last week about, you know, those who stay and fight versus those who walk away, when we were talking about Ursula Le Guin and N.K. Jemisin's short stories. She resigned from her post in protest at the institution's failure to deal with the problem of sexual harassment. And so you can see some of her books here, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, published in 2004, Queer Phenomenology, or orientations, objects and others. And there she talks about, well, Jack Halberstam describes her talking about putting the orient back into orientation. So her work is highly intersectional. She always considers issues of race in tandem with issues of gender and sexuality. And that book looks at kind of disorientation as a space of possibility. So if you feel disoriented at the moment, I would encourage you to kind of embrace that and see how that might make you think in exciting kind of different ways. The Promise of Happiness is probably the work of hers that I've used most in my own research. That was published in 2010. I'll come to that in a moment. On Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life, that was published in 2012, and Willful Subjects, published in 2014. I was drawn to this, to the Killjoy Manifesto as a choice for this session, because I think it really shows how Ahmed can write, you know, theoretical texts, in this case, a manifesto, a kind of political text, in a beautifully literary and playful style. Her work is characterized by provocative plays with words. She pays close attention to etymology, the etymology, for example, of happiness, including hap or chance, and how happiness has come to mean something different as a more scripted disciplinary force. She pays very close attention to familiar utterances and the assumptions or disciplinary charge behind them. She reads migration policy documents in Australia with the same attention to style as she reads literary and cultural texts. And she writes theory and analysis with the same linguistic flair and beauty as literary works. So when I work with her texts with students, I kind of use them to try and break down that barrier that we sometimes see between what we might consider a literary piece of writing and what we might consider a kind of theoretical or political piece of writing. Oops, just lost my PowerPoint. The Promise of Happiness. Sara Ahmed's work has partly been situated in the affective turn in studies in the humanities. And there's a lot of critical debate around what the difference between affect and emotion is. But she kind of sometimes uses those terms quite interchangeably. In the Promise of Happiness, she talks about feminist killjoys that we're going to be thinking about today, but also unhappy queers and melancholic migrants. And she pays close attention to the kind of temporalities. And I saw that Jess put up that question about where would you rather live? You know, where would you like to be, the past, our present, the future? She pays very close attention to the temporalities of certain terms. So for example, how someone saying that you're melancholic because you're holding on to the past might be used as a kind of accusation, come on, get over it, move on. Whereas actually melancholia might be clinging to something that is still persistent in the present. It's just that other people might want you to not feel it as present. I said that, you know, she theorizes from everyday utterances. And in the Promise of Happiness, one of these utterances is, I just want you to be happy. So if you think, say, about a queer child coming out to their parents about their sexuality, and the parent responding, oh gosh, but I just want you to be happy, whose vision of happiness is that? You know, what does happiness mean in that context? And Sara Ahmed talks about these kind of disciplinary happiness scripts. So I just want you to be happy, coming from the parent, as this desire for you to live happiness on their terms. And this might perhaps be, you know, I want you to have a good job, I want you to earn lots of money, I want you to get married, I want you to bear me grandchildren, etc. So she really analyzes, you know, from whose perspective these words are being uttered and what they come to mean. So we talked a bit about, I talked a bit about etymology at the beginning. She says in The Promise of Happiness, can we rewrite the history of happiness from the point of view of the wretch? And she analyzes how wretch refers to a stranger, an exile, or a banished person. The sorrow of the stranger might give us a different angle on happiness, not because it teaches us what it is like or must be like to be a stranger, but because it might estrange us from the very happiness of the familiar. So she really calls us to consider, you know, context, words, concepts that are familiar to us, and sort of defamiliarize them in order to kind of analyze them more deeply. For some reason, there we go. A text published last year, What's the Use, on the uses of use. Really, these quotations from it just show how she's sort of so playful and attentive to language. So we see the word use or references to usual and used in so many different ways throughout this text. And there's a chapter in there called Use in the University that makes reference to UCL. I really encourage you to have a look at that text. She talks about the role of utilitarianism in forming the modern university, and she's quite critical of the foundation of the modern secular university and the differences between what it claimed to be doing and the sort of rhetoric and what it did. So she talks about her method as following words around. And as I said, we've got some examples here from What's the Use. It's not surprising that when the world is not used to you, when you appear as unusual, use becomes what you question. And that she describes there how she came to this kind of critical analysis of the term use. She links this to colonial histories, the category of land being unused as being used to justify colonial appropriation. This is quite topical, I think, the requirement to be useful after that, that advert, you've probably seen it circulating, of the ballerina being told to retrain your futures in cyber. You might have seen that today and yesterday in the news. The requirement to be useful, while often presented as general or even universal, tends to fall upon some more than others. And that might be useful for us. I think the participants today are predominantly from the arts and humanities, thinking about the usefulness of the arts and what people mean when they talk about subjects being useful. Another example from that text: the less a path is used, the less a path is used. How strange that this sentence too makes sense. And Ahmed is working at the moment on a book on complaint, and she talks about paths being unused in kind of institutional complaints procedures, and how if people don't go use certain complaint mechanisms because they're so obscure or inaccessible, they then get used less, and this might be used as a justification to make them sort of defunct. So she really has a kind of really kaleidoscopic approach to a lot of the terms that she follows around. So moving on to today's text, Living a Feminist Life. The Killjoy Manifesto appears at the end of this text. I think it's her most accessible work to date, and yet the rigor of thought is very much there. She drew on a lot of her blog posts from her Feminist Killjoys blog. I've put the URL there, and you can still access a lot of her writings there. But she's kept up a lot of the work that contributed to Living a Feminist Life. She writes of the work of many scholars of colour: Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Gloriane Saldúa, and says that discovering their words made her feel that here was a writing in which an embodied experience of power provides the basis of knowledge. And she talks about how theory can be sort of more effective, as we see here, the closer it gets to the skin. And basically, I think it's interesting to think about theory because we use theory across many different disciplines. It's often a way of having interdisciplinary conversations. And she talks about how in academia, talking about something as theory gives it a lot of capital. And students actually often get quite intimidated of working with students of literature when we say, oh, we're going to look at this theoretical text, and they immediately think it's going to be sort of dense and obscure, and that it's often that it's going to be written in a certain language or produced from a certain location. There's often a predominance of text written in German and French, for example, and when we talk about theory. And she really insists that actually this idea of kind of theory as abstraction from particular local contexts has kind of led this thought astray in a way, and that we need to really really kind of draw it back. She says to abstract is to drag away, detach, pull away, or divert. And she wants to bring feminist theory particularly back to life. So pull it back into the local, back into our embodied context. And I think the Killjoy Survival Kit might help us to do this, because we can connect this text to your start or your continuation, you know, of your life in an institution at UCL. So just before we move on to the breakout groups, I wanted to read one final quotation from Living a Feminist Life. I should add here that staying close to the everyday still involves attending to words and thus concepts like happiness, like will. I am still listening for resonance. I think of feminism as poetry. We hear histories in words, we reassemble histories by putting them into words. This book still follows words around just as I've done before, turning a word this way and that, like an object that catches a different light every time it is turned, attending to the same words across different contexts, allowing them to create ripples or new patterns, like texture on a ground. I make arguments by listening for resonances. The book thus involves repeating words, sometimes over and over again. Words like shatter, words like snap. The repetition is the scene of a feminist instruction. So basically, for Sara Ahmed, writing in this way that she describes of as poetry, as being a grounded everyday reality, does not involve a sort of simplification or a kind of dumbing down of language and of concepts. So I describe this as her most accessible text, and yet, you know, it is still incredibly complex, incredibly poetic, and incredibly attentive to language. So what we're going to do now is split into 3 breakout groups, and I'm really grateful to Lorena and Safi, who are facilitators along with me today. That's everyone back from the breakout rooms. I hope you had as kind of thought-provoking as discussion as we did. Safi, do you want to start us off with feeding back some of the highlights from your conversation?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it was a really good conversation. Let me go back to my notes. Okay. So we sort of started off by mentioning that Ahmed is really asking a lot of us. In her unapologetic sort of, almost sort of like fiercely passionate stance, she's also asking the reader to be unapologetic and to be almost quite militant in calling out and sort of condemning unjust behavior or anti-feminist behavior. Thereby she makes the reader feels sort of not attacked, but the reader feels like he or she is confronted with regard to his or her own stance. Sort of, we mentioned that Ahmed sort of conceives of her own ideological moral world, whereby even remaining silent when someone makes an unjust joke or an anti-feminist joke or a racist joke, this sort of constitutes sort of a sin within her ethical world. And when you compare that to the normal world, it's sort of totally different. It's sort of topsy-turvy and everything's been turned on its head. We also referenced the sort of quite strong elements of humor in the work. This sort of adds to the intensity of the piece, I think. It adds, well, the humor, it creates a playfulness. And I think this playfulness sort of serves to make Ahmed's sort of narrative voice even more real, even more sort of engaging. But I think also functions to sort of in an implicit way, subtly destabilize the ideas that sort of form the status quo in our day-to-day lives. Like, I think, for example, when she's being quite playful with the etymology of words, we're sort of in our minds, we're sort of made to, you know, rethink or receive conventional meanings of words and sort of break them down and look at things sort of in a different way. Then we sort of thought about traditional academic writing versus Ahmed's form of academic writing, or less traditionally academic writing. And we were sort of thinking which one is preferable. And we sort of came to the conclusion that, well, Zoe mentioned that not all academics or writers would be able to, well, I'm not sure if it's Zoe or Jennifer, forgive me, but not all scholars or writers are able to develop her sort of very particular engaging style. So there's that notion. Not everyone has that ability. So not everyone has that sort of playful creative inclination. But also, we came to the conclusion that sort of Ahmed's style of academic writing and the detached style of academic writing, they function in different contexts. So if one wants to experience an escapism, wants to escape, wants to engage with particular theoretical ideas, but sort of a level removed from real life, sort of as a sort of pleasure activity, then the more detached style of writing is better, because with Ahmed's style of writing, as Natasha mentioned, it's very much sort of placing theory and theoretical ideas in practice. And we all sort of got the sense that it's a little bit intense. It can be a little bit much. But I think I could sort of, wrap this up with a final sort of quite significant notion that a number of us sort of struggled with, which was Ahmed's focus on unhappiness, how unhappiness is expected, how it's necessary in this context, how I think it's called, the Greek philosophers called it eudaimonia, wherein sort of like the main final goal of one's actions is happiness. And obviously Ahmed advances an ideology that is anathema to that. And I think that we had trouble accepting that. Sort of reference was made to Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer visual piece that was screened that I didn't have the opportunity to attend. And there was this comparison drawn between the escapism of Janelle Monáe's music videos, this sense of this almost Edenic state, and then Ahmed's work here, which sort of really sort of forces the reader to confront reality directly, but reality in the sense of the criticisms of the naysayers. Yes, so I think that's it for us.
Thanks so much, Safi. That was really great to hear the things that you discussed. And before we go on to Lorena, I'll just comment briefly on a couple of those points. I think, yeah, it is quite an intense piece, but I guess we were talking quite a lot about, I'll come to me at the end, to my group at the end, but we were talking quite a lot about kind of privilege and pleasure and detachment, and, you know, for whom these issues can be considered in an abstract way, and for who can kind of never escape it. It's really interesting thinking about those questions, I think. And and also like this idea of what happiness means, because I feel like it's the vision of happiness that is kind of disciplinary that Ahmed's kind of contesting. And I always think that actually there is joy in killing joy, like from this sort of humor and playfulness of her text. I think, yeah, the killjoy is not necessarily unhappy in some senses of the word. So that's, yeah, it was really interesting to hear what you thought about. Lorena, do you want to come in now with feedback from your group?
Yes. So I was in a group with Maria and Mel, and we started by introducing ourselves, and we realized that in one way or another we are all feminist killjoys. I'm part of the feminist guerrilla, also understood in a very loose manner. So Maria, for instance, she works in different platforms that promote the work of women that are very interesting. One of them is called 100 Heroines, I think, Heroines, to empower women, women's photographers. And just when we were talking about this, the bells of our local church started ringing. So I'm not sure if that was some sort of a reminder of the presence of a patriarchal institution just there. But never mind. We were also talking quite a lot about happiness and about how we are supposed to fit within these kind of social norms, and we are supposed to be happy through things that certain institutions tell us to do or not to do, and how this formula is not extrapolable to everyone. It may work for some people, but it certainly doesn't make happy to many of us. So this idea of there is a way that is imposed upon us to be happy, and how we should confront that. And then Mel made a really interesting comment, which was that if we are going to redefine happiness and the ways in which we may be happy or not, we should also redefine what we consider academic texts. And this was in relation to looking at Ahmed's manifesto as an academic text or not. We talked about the white men institution and how the academia has been very dominated by these thinkers and writers and ways of thinkers that are still very prevalent today, and the need to look at other sources and explore other ways of thinking and writing, and how that can be also some sort of a feminist intervention. And we were talking about how many of the things that Ahmed raised are relatable in one way or another. So we had experiences that we could see reflected in the examples that she uses and the points that she raises. So yeah, I think that was more or less all the things that we discussed.
Thank you, Lorena. Yeah, that's interesting that you were thinking about, yeah, the kind of forms of academic writing and yeah, what we think of as academic writing. And actually, Ahmed describes her citational tool in this text. She talks about citation as being very political in the academic sphere, and she describes her approach in this book as a blunt citational tool. But she basically decides not to cite any. I think it's in this one, isn't it? Not to cite any straight white men. And kind of talks about whose voices get kind of reproduced through citation. But yeah, so that was really interesting to hear your what your group was discussing. I'll just come in with some of the reflections from my group. It was a really interesting mix of kind of science and arts backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds as well. So speaking about different locations and sort of kinship. One of the things we discussed was basically the kind of interdependence of people and kind of interrelationality, and thinking of happiness as collective versus what might be a more sort of individualistic kind of approach to happiness. So we were thinking about how that varies in kind of different places. That was one thing we were talking about. I think most of us in the group felt quite kind of validated by the text, by the idea of the killjoy, and it resonated with us. We had Anna from History of Art here, talking about different manifestos in history, perhaps sort of how some other manifestos might be more visual, might be kind of trying to be more disruptive in their actual form than this text was. And Ahmed in some ways is trying to kind of stretch what the textual can do, but doesn't sort of present it in a kind of visual way. And Anna had come across some other, the sort of Bauhaus manifestos and other manifestos that, yeah, were trying to kind of be more disruptive with form. And yet nonetheless, within the textual form, Ahmed is kind of very much questioning the usual ways of using words and writing in this very poetic way. We talked a bit about humor because she does that. One of the principles is to not laugh at jokes designed to cause offense, and yet as was discussed in other groups, there are moments of humor in the text, and actually in the survival kit, the Killjoy survival kit that comes along with the manifesto, that if you can get hold of the book, you'll see humor is one of the tools in the survival kit. So yeah, we were sort of thinking about different uses of humor. And I guess the possible kind of joy in kind of killing joy that I mentioned. We brought up some of the work of post-colonial Indian critic Gayatri Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak, which some of you might have come across, and we're kind of reflecting a little bit on who Ahmed might be speaking for, whether she sees herself as speaking for anyone. And actually, she sort of very much talks about principles, not in a kind of didactic way. And we were talking about whether a manifesto is didactic or more of a dialogue. And then she has that bit where she talks about a principle in the original sense as a starting point rather than a sort of prescription, which we thought was sort of quite interesting. Who has access to doing this kind of writing, and if they are doing it, then what they need to kind of be sort of open and dialogic in Ahmed's vision, rather than kind of prescribing ways of being in the world. And I think at many points Ahmed kind of points to the privilege in being able to kind of act in a certain way, and very much acknowledges that people might not be in a position always to speak up or to walk away. So we were talking about that a bit. We talked a bit about kind of personal experiences, how it is a very kind of emotive text. Some of you described it as intense. It's quite hard not to have some sort of kind of emotional response to it. And we talked a bit about how sometimes perhaps the space of the sciences might be seen as more sort of depoliticized, and how that is a kind of the kind of flaws in that way of thinking. We talked a bit about kind of machine learning and algorithms, and how this work might be as applicable to a science context as an arts context. Yeah, I think those were the main things that we discussed. So yeah, thank you for coming along. Thank you so much to Safi and Lorena as well for facilitating those groups. And what we're going to do now is, if you could, Jessica's just posted the URL for the rest of the week's program. If you've enjoyed today, you might be interested in the Audre Lorde film screening and discussion on Thursday. We've got the Contemporary Masculinities event tomorrow that, as I said, is also going to include discussions of female masculinity, Jack Halberstam's idea. And then we've got the creative workshop on Friday. So thanks so much for joining us. We'll leave the chat open for sort of 5-10 minutes now if you want to post any kind of comments, responses. And just, yeah, thank you for coming along, and hope to see you at some of the other events.